and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern, and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Thomas Penn, author of The Brothers York, A Royal Tragedy, published by Simon & Schuster, June 16th, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Chris.
So tell me, how did you get into studying this subject and writing a book on it?
Well, I wrote a book, I guess it was probably 8 or 9 years ago now, called Winter King, on the reign of the first Tudor king, Henry VII. And he's really the most unlikely king in English history, I'd say. He for most of his early life, he was an exile. He was a refugee who lived in Brittany, in what's now Western France, and then in France itself, basically on the run. And he was the most improbable king of all. And of course, he defeated one of England's most notorious kings, Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485, and founded the Tudor dynasty as Henry VII. Mm-hmm. But in a way, where Henry Tudor starts is where this current story, as I tell it in The Brothers York, ends, because the youngest of these brothers is Richard III. And in a way, Henry VII, although he's the beginning of this great Tudor story that goes on from the late 15th century into the English 16th century, and throughout the English 16th century, this great age of upheaval and religious reform, it's also the ending of something else, and that is another century, the 15th century, which in England is a century of usurpation. Henry VII is he's the fourth, not the first, but the fourth usurping king in under a century in England. And the dynasty before him, that ruled before him, was the House of York. And this is the dynasty I talk about in this book. And the House of York was a usurping dynasty itself. The first of its kings, Edward IV, who is the oldest of the three brothers that I talk about here, he usurped the throne from the House of Lancaster. And this dynasty, the House of York, burned very, very brightly. It rules from 1461 to 1485. And during this time, it establishes itself as England's undisputed dynasty, royal dynasty. It's authoritative, it's magnificent, it's financially stable. And this is no mean feat, because the context in the 15th century in England is a period of real political instability and real civil turmoil. It's a period of civil war. The wars that go, the civil war that goes on for 3 decades and more. We've got a name for these wars, the Wars of the Roses. It's a struggle between these two royal houses, the Houses of Lancaster, which is the red rose, the House of York, which is the white rose, for the English crown. And the Tudors, who come later, as I say, Henry Tudor, he's the one who claims to reunite England after this period of civil war. To bring these two roses together, and the Tudor emblem itself is a rose. It's the rose both red and white, taking England into this glorious new future. But really, the Tudors were never meant to be. The House of York, the dynasty that comes before it, is the dynasty that should have been the dynasty the Tudors became. And I wanted to investigate this dynasty, why it burned so brightly, why it went horribly wrong, why everything went horribly wrong, why it collapsed in on itself. And at the heart of its downfall, both its success and its downfall, is the relationship between these three brothers, the Brothers York.
Mm-hmm. So in this time period, how much did, say, the peasant classes or the merchant classes have an involvement in what was going on, or was the military forces basically these nobles with their small groups? How was that?
Well, that's a great question. I think I should probably take the first part of your question first. Mm-hmm. The question of the peasant classes. Now, there's a long answer to this really, and it starts in the century before with a pandemic, the Black Death, which in England reduced the population by somewhere between a third and a half. And this has a catastrophic effect on all sorts of things, in particular the labour market. Now, what happens following the pandemic and successive waves of pandemic is that basically those who have labour to sell, peasants, essentially are in the box seat. To put it very, very simply, they can sell their labour for much more because there are far fewer of them. And what happens is that in the 15th century, the early 15th century, you have a situation where the lower classes become, and not just the peasants, but the lower classes, I guess, going up to small landholders and beyond, become much more assertive. Education is becoming more widespread, and people feel that they should have more of a stake in politics. Now, we shouldn't over-egg this because England is still a feudal monarchy, but where this finds expression is in revolts, in peasants' revolts, in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and then much later in Jack Cade's revolt at 1450. But as I say, this isn't just about peasants. It's about gentry. It's about small landholders. It's going really right down the social food chain. And popular rebellion against the inadequacies, the perceived inadequacies of the elites and the failings of the royal family are at they're an undertow of the Wars of the Roses, and popular revolt and populism is something right at the heart of our understanding of the Wars of the Roses. We have without understanding that we can't really understand how the wars developed. And it was something manipulated by both the houses of Lancaster and probably more successfully by the House of York as well. Mm-hmm. And I guess coming on to the second part of your question, the question of the mercantile classes, well, they matter a lot. By the late 1440s, early 1450s, which is the prelude to the story of the Brothers York, England's in a real mess. And part of the reason it's in a mess is that economically it's bankrupt. The Henry VI, the Lancastrian king who precedes the House of York, he's completely incapable. And at a time when monarchy is personal monarchy, when kings don't just reign but they rule, it's a real problem. But the thing is that of course kings depend on cash. As you well know, they depend on cash to raise troops to fight wars. Without money, there can be no military campaigns. And so the loyalty, the support of merchants is extremely important. And the House of York was incredibly successful at raising cash. It was incredibly successful at cultivating the merchants of London and Calais, which was England's entrepot on the northwest coast of France, in a way that the Lancastrians just weren't. London alone gave Edward IV an enormous amount of cash, but they were also successful in reaching out internationally. Edward IV, in particular, he cultivated Italians, and Italians at the time are essentially they rule finance in Europe, and in particular, a few banks. A bank that you'll know well, and your listeners will know well, the Medici Bank of Florence, which is incredibly influential at the time, the biggest bank in Europe. And the Medici Bank was also the single greatest financer of Edward IV and his wars in England, which gives some sense of quite what their reach was.
Mm-hmm. So were they basically paid back interest, these banks? How was their involvement paid out?
Well, yes, they were basically paid in kind. They were paid in offices. So for example, they might have been given positions which were lucrative positions in government, which enabled them to raise money as a result of holding that office. But they were also paid in export licenses. Because these banks, as you all know, they weren't just money lenders, they were also merchants, and they combine the two things. And England at the time has two products in particular to export. It has wool and it has cloth. And English wool and cloth are both very desirable. So in return for not just loans, but luxury, all sorts of luxury items that Italians import into England, fancy textiles and fine wine and so forth. Mm-hmm. They are given these export licenses as a kind of collateral. But the problem is, and this is an interesting point about your question. The problem is that those export licenses are not good enough security, as it turns out. And in fact, by the early to mid-1470s, the Medici branch in London goes bankrupt because Edward hasn't paid back his loans. And this starts a feedback loop that goes from London to Bruges, which is the financial centre of Northern Europe, all the way back to Florence. And eventually, as we know, the Medici Bank goes bust completely. And you can say that it starts, that chain starts in England, in the England of the Wars of the Roses under Edward IV.
Mm-hmm. And then, interesting. And I'm kind of thinking a little bit ahead, where then you had Italians working for Spain, as Spain went out for its searches for new land, basically sending out Christopher Columbus and the like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The Genoese were, as you say, another financial powerhouse, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking with Thomas Penn, author of The Brothers York, A Royal Tragedy. You can find more information about his work on the book's webpage. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please go to my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. If you're interested in other kinds of history, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. So another part of the question I'm trying to figure out is, so when these English kings or lords defeated an enemy, did that mean they had access to a larger tax base, or did they basically pillage and steal from those they conquered to help enrich their treasuries?
Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, taxation is a complex issue at the time, because basically you don't have the kind of universal taxation that you have now. England was quite developed as far as the Western monarchies were concerned, because there was a parliament that kings went to ask for taxes. But the thing is that they could only ask for them. It wasn't like in France, where what the king demanded, the king got. In England, it was much. I mean, all these things are relative. By our standards, it wasn't consensual at all. But there was some form of dialogue between the king and what are known as the commons, so who are representatives of the people. But I guess, kings are always struggling for cash in this period. Their outgoings always are much, much greater than their incomings. And where kings' regular income typically came from things like customs duties as well, import-export taxes, but primarily kings' income came from land. And this was a problem for kings, because this is we think of a feudal, if you think of a feudal structure, mm-hmm. Kings bind their closest supporters to them by giving them land, and then in turn those great lords to whom they give lands to their supporters, and so on and so on and so on down the food chain. That's to simplify quite a complex picture. And what happened in this period was that when say Edward IV seizes the throne in 1461, he confiscates the lands of the Lancastrians who are opposed to him, and he parcels those lands and those titles, the noble titles that go with them, out to his own supporters. But you see, this brings its own problems, because whenever in this age of this great age of usurpation, whenever new kings come to the throne, they're always brought to the throne by a faction of their own supporters. But the thing is, as kings, they can't just govern for their faction; they have to govern for the whole country, and that includes the people who are against them. They have to be representative of England, otherwise they don't last very long. And so if you have a bunch of disgruntled opponents, a bunch of disgruntled Lancastrian lords who have to be brought back into the political fold, those lords will want their lands back. And of course, you only have the pot of jam, as it were. The land can only be spread so far. So you have this situation constantly where this land, these great estates, are always up for grabs, and people are fighting over them the whole time, and they change hands the whole time. What kings give, what kings bestow in land, they then take away and they give to another supporter, as if one supporter falls out of favour. Nowhere is that more true than in Edward IV's dealings with his own brothers, George Duke of Clarence and Richard Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III. And a lot of their problems actually stem from this issue of land, of wealth and power. What happens once you've got it? How do you hold on to it? How do you get more?
Mm-hmm. So I imagine a lot of the people who were trying to gain favor, obviously you're nice to the guy in charge, but at the lower levels, was there much in the way of murder or anything like that as far as how people were dealing with their neighbors who maybe they wanted their land and that sort of thing?
Again, that's a very interesting question. This is a topic that has really been batted about by historians for centuries. I suppose, quite how bloody were the Wars of the Roses. I guess this goes back to my previous answer, because if a king is to rule on behalf of the whole country, and in this kind of government, the king needs the lords to rule. You have a situation where lords are essentially the king's proxies in the regions. A king can't be everywhere, so he relies on these great lords. He gives them lands and he says, right, you rule the northeast of England, Wales, the southwest on my behalf. So he's effectively, in theory, he's supposed to be ruling through these lords. Now, that means that actually executing people and executing political opponents, particularly if you want to unify a country, is not a very good idea. It doesn't send out a good signal. And normally, in normal circumstances, political execution is very rare. In this period, it becomes very common. And that's the thing that people find extremely scary. And I think one of the things that we have to understand about this period is that these wars leave their mark in more than just the violence and the body count. People become very anxious. They become very mistrustful of each other, and they become much more opportunistic. Their loyalties, the whole country is bound together by extended ties of family and loyalty, and these ties of loyalty begin to pull apart. People no longer trust the people who they no longer trust the people who they used to trust. And as indeed one contemporary chronicler says, he says that these wars were father against son, they were brother against brother, and that goes for nobody more than these three brothers that I'm talking about in this book. So it's an age of extreme mistrust. I mean, to your point, that did people lower down the social chain? Did people resort to violence to settle scores over land and property? Yes, they did, and this was but also this was a very litigious age. It's kind of a bit like a 15th century kind of Bleak House. If you look at the legal records of the age, people are pursuing each other through the courts, and cases of inheritance and entitlement to land go on and on and on for years, for decades, even centuries sometimes. So people resort a lot to the law, but there are also a lot of feuds, and there are a lot of local vendettas. And one of the big things about these wars, in fact, is the degree to which little local turf wars, say you've got a couple of families having a spat in Derbyshire in the English Midlands, suddenly blow up into as part of a national conflict. Because if you've got, as you have in the 1460s, you have two crown kings of England, you've got Edward IV of York and you've got Henry VI of Lancaster. If one of these local big men supports Edward IV and the other one doesn't get what he wants, then he'll go off and support another king. So, kings are always being told to keep an eye on local troubles, and they do by and large. So
you mentioned Italians being there. Were there much in the way of foreigners owning land and being part of this whole issue, all this violence and litigation?
Yeah, I mean, this is. I think there are two parts to an answer to this question. I think firstly, as far as Italians were concerned, Italians were much more of the mercantile classes. You know, they were particularly present in London. There were big Italian families, big Italian districts in London, and also you had populations of, in particular, French and what were called Flemings, so people from Flanders, people from the Low Countries. But the Italians in particular were high profile. They were rich. A lot of people came over from Bruges in the Netherlands, where as I say, the Italian banks had long since established themselves. And you have a lot of the Italian population in London is very long established, and a lot of the time people are completely naturalised. They have Italian names, but they've lived in England. They're pretty much English. They've married English wives. They become servants to the crown, but they don't tend to be big landholders. They're more the mercantile classes. But where you do, in terms of foreign involvement in the wars, this is a completely different picture, because preceding the Wars of the Roses, you have this long period known as the 100 Years' War, which starts in the mid-14th century under Edward III, and it ends really just as England is beginning its own civil war. You could say, in fact, that at the end of the 100 Years' War, the war comes home and becomes internecine conflict in England. And the 100 Years' War is basically about the English kings trying to stake their claim to the Kingdom of France, which they believe they're entitled to. So you see all these English armies crossing the Channel, going over to France, trying to claim the throne of France. And this culminates in Henry V, and we've all heard of Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. That's the high point. By 1450, England's lost all its territory in France, and it all goes horribly wrong. But the thing is that in the aftershocks of the 100 Years' War, you have a situation where foreign rulers, particularly the kings of France and the dukes of Burgundy and Brittany, are trying to exploit and influence the breakdown of order and the growth of civil conflict in England by backing one or the other side. And this goes on right through the period I'm talking about, from the 1450s to the 1480s. Edward IV is backed by Burgundy. He then seeks alliances with France. You get a situation where the House of Lancaster is backed by France against him. Later on, under the reign of Richard III, famously, of course, the King of France backs Henry Tudor against Richard III. So the European dimension to this is really, really important.
So just to kind of go back to a question I asked previously, so your book covers winter 1461 to summer of 1485. So the question I have is, during that period, how much of this involved the meeting of forces in battle on the field, and how much was political, and what kind of forces were used when they did meet in battle?
I guess effectively, what happens with this war, or this sequence of conflicts, which stretches, yes, over 3 decades, from roughly around 1455, so 6 years before Edward IV, the oldest of these brothers, comes to the throne of England, up to 1485 and beyond. And in that, you have specific moments where the conflict really does flare up. And the first of these moments is, apart from 1455, where you have a street fight in the Battle of St. Albans, but the first big moment here is in spring of 1461, or rather the winter and spring of 1461. And at this moment, very clearly polarized, you have the dividing lines are drawn. You do definitively have the House of Lancaster against the House of York, and England is split down the middle. So, for example, in England's most bloody battle, the Battle of Towton, which was fought in a raging blizzard on Palm Sunday, 1461, in Yorkshire, you effectively have all of England's nobility deployed on the battlefield against each other, and this is a incredibly violent and bloody battle, even by the standards of the time. And heralds, who were the main recorders of the battle's progress, at the time assessed that somewhere around 28,000 people died, and even if it wasn't that many, it was getting on for that. So, these are kind of First World War numbers we're talking about here, in a population which, was infinitely smaller. So maybe 2.5 million people in England, which meant that if you had 50,000 people on the battlefield, then probably everybody knew somebody who had fought, and many people knew somebody who had died just in that one battle on that one day. And after Towton, which Edward IV wins, Edward IV he goes to London and is crowned, and thereafter the conflict morphs into a kind of insurgency and counterinsurgency situation, particularly in the north of England, where Edward IV is trying to, and his proxies are trying to mop up Lancastrian resistance, and that continues throughout the early 1460s. Now, by the late 1460s, and this is one of my main arguments in this book, actually, the conflict starts to change. Edward IV is kind of establishing himself as England's king, but the thing is that his brothers and his very influential older cousin, Richard Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, his brother Clarence and Warwick are becoming, for various reasons, increasingly disgruntled with his rule. And by the time conflict re-erupts in the late 1460s, in the most spectacularly unpredictable way, you have a situation where Warwick and Clarence, so Yorkists, are against Edward IV, the king who Warwick, the kingmaker, has put on the throne. And they go abroad to France and they link up with exiled Lancastrians. So you have this crazy situation where disgruntled Yorkists link up with exiled Lancastrians, come back and throw Edward off the throne. And people, even by the standards of the time, this is head-clutchingly crazy. You get Italian ambassadors in France writing dispatches saying, "I can't really believe I'm writing these words. I must be dreaming," says one of them. So this is incredibly unpredictable. So you have a sequence, again, of battles in the late 1460s, early 1470s. In 1471, Edward himself comes back from exile, obliterates his Lancastrian opponents, makes up with his brother Clarence, and then they go forward. And this is a period, the 1470s, in which the Yorkists are the only game in town. Edward IV is on the throne, and all is set fair. He has his sons, by his Queen Elizabeth Woodville, so obviously with male heirs being the prerequisite for dynastic succession, he's set up. But the problem now, in the 1470s, comes within his own family, and with an increasingly toxic relationship between his two younger brothers, George Duke of Clarence and Richard III. Now, this results in George Duke of Clarence being murdered by the king, by Edward IV, his own brother, who's got thoroughly cheesed off with him, and he's imprisoned in the Tower of London, declared a traitor and murdered in 1478. But then in 1483, this is the moment then where you have the next flare-up of military activity, because this is when Edward IV dies in 1483, and he dies obviously leaving two young sons, aged 12 and 10, and this is where his own younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who becomes Richard III, decides to seize power for himself. So then you have a situation where these aren't really, we're not talking about pitched battles, we're talking more about the usurpation, the double usurpation of Richard III, which happens in April and then June 1483, and then finally in 1485 when you have the Battle of Bosworth. So that was the long answer. The very short answer is that they're flare-ups. And you've always got this undercurrent of conflict, but what's one of the things that's surprising in the age is how, of course, normal life does continue. People don't stop trading, they don't stop living, they don't stop having relationships, politics doesn't stop, and all this continues around these great flare-ups of military activity.
So the impression I get is, with the big battles, you have your forces are your armored knights and your spearmen and your archers and that sort of thing. And it sounds like during the smaller flare-ups, I imagine, groups of unarmored men with their swords going about, almost like groups of thugs doing their thing. Tell me if
That's a very good. I mean, gangs would be a better. Thugs, gangs. Yes, I think that's right. And the degree to which these gangs are then conscripted and co-opted into armies is an interesting point too. And I think something that hasn't really been explored that much. I guess the composition of armies is an intriguing thing because, often the House of York, for example, the Yorkists against the Lancastrians, the Yorkists had the smaller armies, but they had the better equipped, more experienced, the more disciplined men. And often you would have, at the core of armies, you would have the households of a king and their major lords. And these would be people who worked for them, who often formed their first line of security. It would be their close servants. And they would be the people who were your plate-armored knights, right? Who fought around the king, who would form these squads, which were very disciplined, whose job was to protect the king, and which would basically be the focal point for armies. And then to kind of bulk out your army, if you like, you had conscripts. You had people who were as the phrase had it, arrayed specifically for battles, who a lot of the time would be fighting in completely unfamiliar terrain. You might have people who were essentially peasants from East Anglia, who would be called on to march 200 miles west to Wales and fight against people that they didn't know, that they couldn't understand, in country that they were completely unfamiliar with. And, the problem is with these conscripts is that they're not regular soldiers. They are inexperienced a lot of the time. And, as a result, they're not disciplined and their morale is not good. And just like anybody who gets told to pick up, a weapon and turn out and fight, you imagine, you'd run away, and people did a lot of the time. And this is where, the House of York's greater discipline told against Lancaster, which often had much bigger armies a lot of the time. So yeah, it was a mixture of conscripts and a mixture of what were called retainers, who belonged to lords and men of the king's household as well.
I'm speaking with Thomas Penn, author of The Brothers York, A Royal Tragedy. You can find more information about his work on the book's webpage. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please go to my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. If you're interested in other kinds of history, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. So was it more, as far as the composition of forces, was it more a question of how they wanted to spend their money or what they had access to? I imagine if you have a small but disciplined force, you're spending your money on more expensive but better troops rather than spreading it amongst a bunch of conscripts. Is that?
That's right. I think that's fair to say. Soldiers were paid wages, of course. They were paid by the day often, for a period of months. But what we have to understand here is very important, is that there are no standing armies at this time. So a lot of the time the king might pay for men of his own household, to kit out men of his own household, but you're talking perhaps, about hundreds of people. You're not talking about thousands or even tens of thousands. A lot of the time when kings ask their supporters, their main supporters, so lords and knights, to turn out, they're asking those same supporters to bring their own men with them and to make sure that they're properly kitted out. So a lot of the time it's the responsibility of the individual knight or the individual lord, or even sometimes the individual soldier, to bring what he's got with him. And often you'd have weapons which were also double as farming implements. So the billhook, for example, which was incredibly effective at dragging knights off horses, which had a blade but also a point. People would bring those kinds of things with them. But again, often if you're rank and file, you've maybe got a leather jerkin and a metal helmet. You don't have your plate armor. That's for the elites, or that's for the people who could afford it.
So, as you say, there was no standing army, but how many of the citizens of the country, I'm familiar with, like, there were crossbow guilds and maybe there were archery guilds, how many people were skilled at military arts, but that wasn't their career. You know, they did something else, and maybe when a war started, they were hired for their skill, their military ability.
Well, again, that's a good question. One of the distinguishing features of the English military, of course, is the longbow in this period. And the English in France, I talked earlier about the 100 Years' War, where you have English armies crossing the Channel, going into France and fighting armies in France. Over this period of time, generations of people acquire experience, particularly with the longbow. So by the time the civil wars come along, break out in the late 1450s and early 60s, you've got a generation of soldiers who fought in France who know how to fight. Mm-hmm. So these are people who are beloved and they are disciplined. And this might seem to contradict just what I've said about people being conscripts and peasants, but the two kind of go hand in hand. And indeed, it was by law, people were required to turn out and practice their archery, practice the long shooting at the butts, the targets. So practicing longbow every Sunday. In fact, that was a law that was repealed only very recently in England, crazily enough. But yeah, so people knew archers knew how to fight, and archers were a big component of any army in this period.
And just to wrap this up, though, how would people be recruited when it was time to fight? Did they send out, headhunters to raise companies, and how did that work?
Well, more or less they did, yeah. They had the authority for raising armies always comes from the king. And without that authority, you basically have a situation where lords are raising their own private armies. If they're not raising it with the king's approval, the king is effectively the commander-in-chief. Mm-hmm. If you don't have that approval, then you're essentially doing something illegal. And what the king distributed to his chief supporters, the people who he expected to raise armies on his behalf, were what were called commissions of array. And this was basically a document that said, I, the king, authorize you to raise armies on my behalf, and it was affixed the royal seal, this great wax cake, if you like, imprinted with the king's own seal. And so, equipped with these commissions of array, lords and knights would go out into their own countries, their own regions, their own lands, and they basically say, right, I need you to get me 4 men, I need you to get me 6 men, or whatever, and we'll muster at these points throughout the country. So a king would, maybe if the king was fighting, if Edward IV was, say, fighting a battle in the northeast of England, he'd set out with his own army, his own however many thousand men that he'd already got together from London, and at these muster stations, more companies and more groups would join up with him in the hope that by the time he gets to where he needs to fight, say Towton, he's got his 25,000 men or whatever. In practice, and particularly as the wars go on, it won't surprise you to hear that people were very unwilling to turn out and fight. But the simple reason that they were on a hiding to nothing. If they ended up on the wrong side, then they would have committed treason because they would have fought against the victorious king. And, often, as I said earlier, you'd have a situation where people are going out of their own regions and they're fighting in completely unfamiliar territory. And for what? So a lot of the time you have people dodging these commissions for rape. Also, you have a situation where the people who are meant to be raising troops for one king abuse it, and they actually go over to the other king with their document and say, right, I'm going to raise troops, but I'm going to take them to the other side. So it's an incredibly messy situation a lot of the time.
Wow, that's interesting. So before I turn to how you did your research, are there any other significant aspects to this book that you'd like to point out?
I mean, one thing I would like to talk about a little bit are the 3 brothers that are really at the heart of the book, and of course, the one out of these brothers, the one who your readers and your listeners will have heard of is the youngest one, and that's Richard III. But it's the first brother too, who perhaps is not so well known in the public imagination, but who is extremely compelling. And Edward IV, who comes, the oldest brother York, he comes to the throne aged 18 in 1461. As I say, he fights 2 battles Mortimer's Cross and Towton, and he wins the throne from this completely incapable Lancastrian king, Henry VI. And Edward IV is one of the things that your listeners might find interesting is that, of course, Edward IV is the grandfather of Henry VIII. And like Henry VIII, he has this similar charisma. He's, aged 18, he's 6'4", at a time when most people were a foot short, and he's absolutely gigantic, and he's magnetic, charismatic. He's a war leader, and he walks like a king. He talks like a king. He's very beautiful. People who see him in the flesh say he's the most beautiful prince that my eyes ever behold. He does everything very intensely. He's a fighting, government, deal making. He's a trader. As I said earlier, he likes having merchants around him. He behaves, one chronicler says, rather sniffily like a merchant, and he parties. And he allows people round him because the closer you get to him, I said earlier that monarchy is personal, and the closer people get, the lovelier he seems. And nobody believes in his own effect upon people quite as much as Edward does. His own motto, everybody had mottos at this time, was a French one, Comfort et liesse, which means comfort and joy. But the thing about Edward is there's a darker side to him. So everything he does is very calculated, whether he's raising credit from our Italian bankers or working out quite how the impact of his own physical presence on supporters. He's very excessive. He eats and drinks a lot. He's clearly a functioning alcoholic from a very early age. And the doctors stand next to a king at table trying to moderate his diet. And he's a real stuffer and guzzler. And people are unable to control his binging. He's a womanizer, a really rapacious womanizer, actually. And this appalls even his close supporters and his followers. And he's a narcissist. He's a typical narcissist. He displays a marked lack of empathy, a completely thin-skinned inability to accept criticism, constantly wants affirmation, and indecision that manifests itself at crucial moments. And I mean, we can come on to this, but what I've tried to do by pulling together these different layers of archival material is to paint this picture of Edward IV. And for me, he's a king who is compulsively fascinating.
So let's turn to how you did your research. What archives did you use? What was your primary sources of information?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about researching this period is that it's appropriate really for this very fractured period. Is that the chronicle, the documentary sources as well are very fractured. They're very fragmentary. So you have, and they're very uneven, and they're often very unreliable as well. So you have everything from chronicle accounts, which are people who have actually witnessed stuff going on, or they've heard about things going on, and they're reporting it, to things like government accounts. There are a lot of different kinds of archives that are preserved here in the UK and also in European archives as well, to legal records, to diplomats' accounts, which are often fascinating. What you rarely have, to be honest, is the kind of personal records that more modern biographers might have. So you don't really have diaries. With exceptions, you don't really have many letters either. The exception being that there are a couple of letters that exist a bit lower down the social food chain, such as the Paston letters, which are wonderful, but they only cast quite indirect light on these three royal brothers. So what I've tried to do is to layer up these different kinds of archives, and through layering them up, I guess, a bit like applying washes to a canvas, to try and build a picture of these different personalities. And I think, obviously you have to proceed with extreme caution, and you have to approach them with an open mind, which, when you have an idea in your head and you're looking for evidence to support it, can sometimes be hard. And you have to read very, very closely, a bit like panning for gold. You've really got to keep your eye open for the glint of precious metal, as it were. But I have found, I made some real discoveries, I think, and for me, archival research is the thing that I love.
So I know in the UK they preserve a lot of their history, their physical history. Are there any notable locations or artifacts that you personally were able to interact with when you did your research, something maybe out of the normal person's eye or awareness?
Yeah, I think so. One of the great things about the archives in the UK is that they are open to all, and so anybody can in theory turn up and look at these archives. I think one out of many really artifacts that is under close wraps and which I was able to look at is the most extraordinary parchment genealogical roll of which was actually pinned up probably in Westminster Abbey when Edward was crowned, when Edward IV was crowned, or around that time. It was pinned up for people to look at, and what a genealogical roll is essentially it's a lineage. So it portrays the legitimacy of the roll's holder. It will trace their family back to time immemorial, and of course, in an age in which kings are fighting, the throne of England is contested, your ability to demonstrate your superior lineage is crucial, really, to show that you have the best claim to the throne. And what this roll does is to show precisely this. And as I say, it was pinned up. So you think of a roll, the way that information used to be stored on paper, on vellum, was a roll. So it was rolled, it was literally rolled up. That's what the roll means, and that's how it was stored. But this one, if you unroll it, you can see the pinholes in the corners where it was pinned up for people to look at it. Because many people, of course, couldn't read, but they could see. And so what the roll is it's very, very splendid, and it shows pictorially, a bit like a kind of storyboard, how Edward IV claimed the throne and the battles that he won, and it's beautifully illuminated with gold leaf and with all sorts of vivid colours that still remain vivid, extraordinary, even over a period of more than half a millennium. So that was a great privilege to look at.
Did it just have names, or were there any images or coats of arms or anything like that?
Well, there were lots of images, and I think it was split into two parts. So, firstly, at the bottom half of the roll, it shows Edward's descent all the way back into the mist of time, into British prehistory. And what it does is it shows, aptly enough for this period, it's depicted as a rose bush. So you have these intertwining thorns weaving their way up the parchment roll, and in every rose, as a rose flowers, it depicts an individual, and each face is this wonderfully drawn little cartoon face, showing the individual, the features of the individual. It's incredibly detailed. And then the top half, as I say, you've got these scenes from Edward's battles, and they're scenes as well that they're paralleled with scenes from the Bible. So, for example, there's a biblical analogue to each. It's almost likening Edward to a biblical hero, and yeah, it's basically all done as pictures.
What part of the research was most enjoyable for you?
That's an interesting question. I enjoyed it. I loved researching the Italian stuff, I have to say, because I think the links between finance and the economy and the needs of the economy and trade, this kind of history, and the political history are imperfectly understood, but they're always two sides of the same coin. And I really enjoyed getting into the nitty-gritty of finance, both the mercantile finance, the Italian finance, and how it mapped onto the political events of the time. So that was very enjoyable. I also enjoyed researching Richard III, really, who's incredibly challenging, because I guess one of the key reasons I wrote the book was to put the very extreme events of his usurpation and his brief and completely calamitous reign in context. So I wanted to move beyond the twin stereotypes that really dominate so much debate on him, which is incredibly polarized and gives rise to great emotion, understandably, and to give a sense of the world out of which he emerged, which formed him, and to try and understand why he acted like he did, really. So I'd say that Richard was another very satisfying period of research. Yeah.
What was the most surprising thing you discovered?
I would say that it's probably, again, goes back to Richard, because, I guess a lot of the time, there's this question of why this question about Richard is why can a man how can a man so obviously loyal to his brother Edward IV, and throughout this period of civil conflict, Richard, as he grows up, he's almost a decade younger than Edward IV, but he's the loyal one. He sticks to Edward. He becomes his real right-hand man. And why can he be so incredibly loyal to Edward IV and then prove so incredibly disloyal to his brother's offspring after Edward IV dies? And I guess such a question presupposes a kind of transformation in character in Richard, that he kind of shifts from a very dutiful Dr. Jekyll type to a usurping Mr. Hyde. But I think what I found really is that he doesn't change, because Richard he grows up, as all the brothers do, but particularly so in this age of extreme political instability. And Richard's, I guess, reaction to that is that he craves all the things that he doesn't have. He craves order, he craves security, he craves clarity, and he finds these qualities in the abstract ideals, things like chivalry, things like justice, things like piety and loyalty, that he finds in the books that he reads and owns. And Richard is, of all the brothers, Richard's a great bibliophile, and we're lucky enough still to have many of the books that he had in his library. They still survive with us. And he really believes in these ideals. And more than most people, he draws on them to understand and interpret and sometimes shape the very messy reality around him. So, you can see this in one of the books that he owns, which is a chivalric romance about a knight, the greatest knight in all the world, Ipomedon. And then at the bottom of one page, Richard writes his motto. He writes his motto that he had as a young man, "Ton le désiré," which is a French phrase, meaning I've wanted it so much. So he reads about the knight, and he says, "What I want to be like this virtuous knight." And he has this very binary view of the world, I guess. He sees himself on the side of virtue and right and good, and his enemies on the side of evil. And that really, that really helps him when he's Edward's right-hand man. It serves him very well on the battlefield. He's a very ferocious fighter, which is surprising in a way, because he's increasingly afflicted by this back problem, this condition called scoliosis, and he's quite thin, but he makes up for it with this incredible courage. As his brother's right-hand man, this works for him really well, but as king, it serves him very poorly, because he comes to the throne and he thinks, well, I want to be the ideal king. I've got what it takes, but these ideals really swiftly disintegrate on contact with reality, and his response to the unpredictability and the confusion of real life events, rather than the very clear, fixed narratives of books, it results in, I guess, a kind of what you might call it a kind of cognitive dissonance. He can't bear confusion. He can't bear lack of clarity, and this leads him to get rid of political opponents and anybody who stands in his way. So I think that probably this appreciation and understanding of how Richard's formation led him to act as king was one of the things that I felt very clear about and was happy to clarify to my mind anyway.
Mm-hmm. So knowing there are lots of gaps within the historical record, was there a particular question that you really wanted an answer to and got to after a lot of research, or maybe still open, that you'd love to get some kind of conclusion on?
Ooh, it's an interesting one. Did Richard III kill the princes in the tower?
Fair enough. That's, yeah. Was there anything in your research, and again, researching old history can be pretty dry, but was there anything that you came across that had an emotional impact on you, either positively or negatively?
That's a good question. I think that it's very possible to find. I think that really the way that historical characters who from such a distance we can tend to view characters as perhaps types, or we can perhaps not see them so much as humans. But I think the way that the historical record is always yielding up examples of people's humanity in all its contradictory complexity. And the more that you look at that, even the apparently the driest kind of material, government records, legal records, you see examples of this humanity, of people making the wrong decisions, of taking decisions for what they think are the right reasons, but actually end up being totally catastrophic. Or, on the other hand, examples of incredibly cruel behaviour. And I think, weirdly, you come across this time and again. So I guess that one example would be from the letters of a Norfolk knight, John Paston, whose career follows is at court and as a Yorkist, and then as a Lancastrian turned Yorkist, follows all the way through this period. And his letters home are full of this kind of humanity. He's very excited to be at Edward IV's court. He's really thrilled by spectacular jousts and great feasts, and at the same time, when he makes the wrong decisions, which he does, he's on the run, he's wounded by an arrow, he's really concerned, he's really worried, he's desperately anxious. And one of his last letters, he turns up in London to progress some legal business with the king, and he's really afraid because the plague's broken out again. And he said, I went to my lodgings in London. He said they weren't as clean as I hoped they'd be, and the plague's about, and by the way, can you send some stuff from home? I really want these particular books, and can you send this stuff that I'd like to have with me? And a month later, he's dead. And that really, particularly in our age now, I think that letters like that have a real impact across the centuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, apart from filling the historical record, what do you hope the book will do?
Well, I hope it will. I hope that it will act as perhaps a new way and a fresh way of seeing this incredibly fraught, violent, unstable, very rich time. But I also hope that it will direct people's attention to this dynasty, this period, which so often tends to be overshadowed by the people who the dynasty that followed it, which is, of course, the Tudors. And as I say, the Yorkists, in a way, were the dynasty that the Tudors should have became, and their tragedy was that they destroyed themselves and let the Tudors in through the back door. So I hope in some way it will help reestablish this period in the popular imagination.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any difficulties getting the book finished or published?
No, not at all. The book took me a long time, and it, like writing so often is, it was a very intense period, particularly towards the end. But no, no, not really.
Okay, good. What's your current or next writing project?
I'm sort of keeping that under wraps at the moment because I'm still thinking about it. But it will be something quite closely linked to this, but also something of a sideways move. But I'll be sure to let you know as soon as I've nailed it.
Good. Where can people find you online? Do you have a website or social media?
Do you know, I'm terrible. I don't do any social media at all.
So I guess people can find information about your work on book sites like Amazon and that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, that's great, Chris. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for your questions, and they're very provoking in a good way.
Good. Well, thank you for speaking with me.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please subscribe to it and rate it and review it if possible. I have many other options as well to get great military history information. You can find links to interesting military history videos on my Facebook page, WarScholar. You can find links to interesting military history news articles, military history archaeology information, and academic information on my Twitter page, WarScholar. You can find photos on my Instagram page, Chris Alvarez WarScholar. You can find my military history videos on my YouTube page, WarScholar 1945. You You can also sign up for my newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. In the newsletter, I post additional video and news links, as well as regular updates on new military history books being published. Thank you for listening.